Y las moriscas.
Hello, and welcome to Islam in the Middle Ages, a series for IHSHG, examining the Islamic world from Muhammad to the Mughal Empire on the first Sunday of each month. In our last episode, we examined the final years of the Crusades, the dramatic rise and fall of Saladin and the Ayyubid dynasty, the coming of the Mongols to the Middle East, and the rise of the Mamluks that breathed life into the divided world of medieval Egypt and turned it into an influential power in the area until the age of the Ottomans. Today, we're taking a break from our narrative to look in more depth at the Assassins, one of the most iconic and indeed infamous organizations of the medieval Islamic world. So much so, in fact, that their name is synonymous with hired killing, owing to the high-profile murders the group committed during the roughly 300 years of their organization being active. They form the basis of a great number of characters across modern media, and were even the inspiration for a highly successful series of video games. The story behind this group, however, is equally as fascinating, and is one of an obscure, persecuted sect of Shi'ism, finding a unique, albeit frightening method to defend their numbers and rise to become one of the most feared powers in the region. This is quite the tale, where the truth can be just as strange as fiction, and I look forward to sharing with you the story of what has made this group and its name so infamous throughout history, and even through to the modern day. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of the IHSHG, and I would like to thank them for giving me the platform to be able to host this. Do be sure to check out their website, Facebook page, and YouTube channels for more historical discussions in English and Portuguese. So, let's begin. The origin of the Assassin Order can be found in the development of Shia Islam in the 8th and 9th centuries. In 760, the Ismaili movement of Shi'ism formed, believing that the 7th Shia Imam, Ismail, was the last legitimate leader of the community, and that there would be no more until the end of the world. Note here that Imam refers to the spiritual leader of the entire Ismaili world, rather than just the worship leader at a mosque. This contrasted with what would go on to be called the Twelver Shia movement, that continued accepting the authority of new imams up until the 12th, after which they believed that the imam went into hiding, or ghaiba as it's sometimes known, ahead until the end times. The Ismaili movement also rejected the authority of al-Mahdi, the first Caliph of Fatimid Egypt, who was largely regarded as a heretical offshoot to true Shia practice. As we've already established in earlier episodes, the Shia community was, by and large, a minority in the Islamic world that lacked any serious political and religious clout until the rise of the Fatimids in the 10th century, and even then, this dynasty was treated largely with hostility and suspicion in the Sunni world. There was a brief hope that things would get better in 813, when Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun tried to bridge the Sunni-Shia gap, but after the rejection of his proposal for a Shia successor in the form of the spiritual leader al-Rida, Shia Muslims fell back into the margins of society, as an increasingly strident Sunni community began to assert itself across the echelons of the elite within the Islamic world. From there on in, Shi'ism lived under the shadow of Sunni rule, with varying degrees of acceptance and resistance, ranging from passive acceptance of Sunni rule to outright rebellion. The most high-profile case of this being the Zanj slave revolt of the 870s. Going into the second millennium, however, the call for resistance to Sunni rule began to mount, growing stronger as Shia dynasties established themselves in Egypt and Morocco, and the stridently Sunni Seljuks came into power in the 1060s, leaving Shia Muslims vulnerable to violence and political marginalization on a scale that hadn't yet been seen in the Islamic world. Tensions eventually came to the fore in 1090, when a sect of Ismaili Shiism set up a community in the mountains of Elburz in northern Iran. They differed from most Ismailis in two key senses. First of all, they venerated a Fatimid prince by the name of Nizar, a man martyred in the bloody politics of the Fatimid court, who the sect believed to be the true final imam of the Shia world. Secondly, and even more crucially, unlike many Shia sects in this period, this new group decided to take direct and violent action against the Seljuk Empire. The group lacked political and economic clout, and only had a small military following that was largely dwarfed by the sizable professional forces of the Seljuks. To assert themselves, therefore, they decided to commit high-profile acts of murder against prominent political and religious figures within the Sunni world, to terrify its people and call into question the strength and stability of the Seljuk Empire. And with that, the order that would come to be known as the Assassins was established. The murders that would give the group its ferocious reputation were carried out by young men within the sect who were trained, ritually initiated, and then ranked according to their own ability, rather like the knightly orders of Europe. Underneath the imam who led the movement, there were four ranks: Lasik, or adherent, Rafiq, or companion, propagandist, and great propagandist. One condition of membership was unflinching loyalty to the order and a willingness to die in pursuit of the group's aims, something that would impress and frighten outsiders commenting on the movement in sources from the period, and also spawn a variety of curious anecdotes about the order's practice, as we will later see. They were led by an imam by the name of Hassan ibn al-Sabah, a Shia missionary from Egypt, and set up a castle by the name of Alamut in the Elburz Mountains. This was an ideal stronghold from which to launch their attacks, as it was embedded in the peaks of the mountain range and accessible only by a narrow ravine. This made the castle very difficult to besiege, which in turn helped the assassins to carry out their work without fear of reprisal. As the movement grew and expanded its influence, it would go on to establish similar mountaintop fortresses and gain money from taxation of the local population. Needless to say, the order was also well supplied with other members who served the order in ways apart from the killing of its enemies, as well as ordinary individuals who were happy to live under their rule. It bears mentioning that, despite their reputation, the order didn't kill indiscriminately, and chose only specific targets for specific reasons to advance their aims, such that the killing of a few powerful individuals would frighten their enemies into silence and avoid direct conflict that would result in much higher death counts by comparison. As a result of this, the order was able to grow and attract many lay members who were happy to place their trust within the protection that the order and the clout that they commanded provided. What placed the assassins on the political map, of course, was the string of infamous killings they undertook of prominent leaders of their enemies. This was often done as an act of retaliation if their land or holdings was threatened by other powers in the region, or to maintain the balance of power, such that no one polity would become too influential. Pairs of trained killers would be sent to the target, armed with daggers, and some sources even claim that the imam himself would give the weapon to the killers before telling them their assignment. They would then make their way to the vicinity of their target, using a variety of methods of stealth. One source claims, for example, that they disguised themselves as beggars, monks, or students at the local madrasa to draw as little attention to themselves as possible. When the killings did take place, they would often be done out in the open, in crowded areas, to maximize the shock that the attack would cause. And whilst it was important for them to reach their target undetected, many assassins expected to be captured or killed after the attack itself had succeeded. Indeed, they were often referred to within the order as fida'in, that is to say, martyrs willing to die for their cause. Despite the enormous danger that assassins placed themselves in by doing this, their missions were consistently very successful, and this proved to be terrifying for many leaders of the Islamic and later crusading worlds at the time. It threatened the stability of political entities in an era where dynastic rule was the order of the day, and called into question the ruler's ability to protect the most important people within their kingdom. There was also a lingering fear that they could strike at any time and would continue to do damage until their demands were met. This was made even worse by the fact that assassin castles tended to be built in easily defendable spots in the mountains of Persia and the Levant. This made besieging them or trying to respond to their attacks extremely difficult, and even if the Saint Killer was captured or executed, assassin imams could rely on a steady supply of new young men willing to die for the cause to replace him. The name assassin comes to us from the Arabic word hashashin, meaning literally hash eaters. Some have gone on to speculate that this name was derived from the fact that assassins consumed hashish before going on to killing assignments, possibly as a way to calm nerves and adrenaline before the critical moment. Although this sounds far-fetched, and indeed is disputed amongst historians of the movement, it's not entirely out of the bounds of reason that the assassins did consume drugs before their mission. There are ample examples across history of drugs and alcohol being used in combat situations to alter the mindset of people present and to allow them to push themselves further than they would naturally be able to. There's evidence of cocaine being used in the World Wars to promote alertness, for example. And in the Vietnam War, amphetamines and sedatives were consumed by soldiers for broadly the same purpose. It begs mentioning too that the missions assassins undertook, as we've already seen, were very conspicuous acts that carried a high chance of being caught and executed during or after the killing itself. If some assassins then did take hash to take the edge off their work, it wouldn't be a surprising element of the job at all. This being said, it's more likely that this was an epithet levied against the movement. Hashish was common across the Islamic world, but its consumption was somewhat stigmatized, and it's possible that the assassins' erratic, violent acts of murder, especially against prominent religious and political leaders, came to be equated with the kinds of people who consumed the drug regularly. Rather in the way that the words junkie and drunkard carry suggestions of violence, unpredictability, and social stigma. Indeed, it's worth mentioning that our external accounts of the assassins in this period generally tend to be problematic, and as far as I'm aware, there are very few credible sources from the assassins themselves that survive to us today. This makes reconstructing assassin history challenging, as one often has to differentiate between myth and reality, and keep in mind the perspective from which these sources were written. The very real issue here is that the assassins were subject to both intense hatred and fascination, owing to the movement's success and the conspicuous devotion of its members to the cause. Subsequently, therefore, our sources tend to be scattered with exaggerations that make the assassins seem more vicious or stranger than they really were. For example, One account of the order that survives from Marco Polo's travels in Persia recounts the way that the Imam allegedly prepared killers ahead of their assignments. According to this source, the Imam would give the new aspiring assassin hashish to dull their senses, and then take them to a secret room in the order's castle filled with beautiful young women that would engage intimately with him. Afterward, the Imam would tell the youth that if he killed and died in the name of the order, he would be rewarded with greater experiences just like that for eternity in paradise. It's likely that this tale was fabricated over years of speculation about the assassin order's inner workings, that Polo received decades after their abolition. But nevertheless, it's an interesting example of how the group's fearsome reputation led to tales being spun about them that spiraled into the extreme. Naturally, for the historian, the challenge here is knowing what is exaggeration and what isn't, because, as should be fairly obvious by now, reality can be just as obscure as fiction. One gets the sense, however, that from these accounts, the idea that an obscure religious minority with such enormous clout didn't sit easily with both Sunni Muslims and Crusaders in this period, and many of these accounts existed to either express the fear and resentments of the writer, to provide closure as to why the order was so effective at what they did, or to put the order's success down to mysterious or exotic causes, to avoid the unnerving reality that they were just a deeply committed organization that were very good at the work that they did. So now we've laid the groundwork, I will offer a brief overview of their timeline and the more conspicuous incidents in the movement's nearly 300 years of activity. Shortly after their establishment in 1090, the assassins began to make a name for themselves, when in 1092 they murdered Nizam el-Mulk, the Wazir of Baghdad and one of the most influential political writers of the period and staunch advisor to Seljuk rulers. Later, in 1103, the Levantine branch of the order was then established in the mountains of Syria and Palestine, under the leadership of the talented Imam Rashid ad-Din, known as the Old Man of the Mountain, a title that every subsequent Imam in the Levantine branch would take. These Imams were diplomatically highly impressive figures, who found ways to maintain negotiations with Crusaders, Turks, and Mongols in this period, sometimes at the same time. And as we've seen from earlier episodes, this was no mean feat, given the complicated politics of the region. The branch commanded a number of impressive fortifications, such as the castle of Nasiri in Palestine, that was in striking distance of Jerusalem and Tripoli, and the famous castle of Masyaf near Aleppo, that granted the assassins proximity to all of the major cities of Syria. It didn't take long for the Levantine branch to start asserting themselves on the map. In 1113, the prominent Abbasid military leader Maudud was murdered by a lone killer. Their identity remained a mystery, but the assassins were suspected to have been behind the operation, owing to a number of successful kills that had happened in the years previous. Then, in the 1140s, negotiations opened with the Crusader kingdom of Antioch, and the assassins pragmatically assisted them in campaigning against the staunchly Sunni Zangid Turks. Although this campaign resulted in a Zangid victory, it helped place the assassins on the map as an established player in the labyrinthine politics of the crusading world. In 1152, the Templars in Jerusalem made the fatal error of granting Raymond II, Count of Tripoli, land in Palestine that was owned by the assassins, a move that resulted in the latter's demise a few months later. By the 1170s, they were a well-established power within the region, with 60,000 active members across 10 fortresses throughout the Levant. They even managed to secure payment of tribute from the Kingdom of Jerusalem, receiving 2,000 gold byzants per year to allow the Templars to move freely throughout their territory and receive help from them against Zangid incursions. Despite some attempts from rulers of Jerusalem to subsequently shed this commitment, relations between the assassins and Templar orders remained surprisingly cordial throughout the period. For the assassins, the Templars proved an effective check on Sunni power in the region, and for the Templars, having local allies was a relief in a region surrounded by committed enemies to their cause, which is a fascinating deviation from modern perspectives that tend to pit the assassins and Templars against each other as bitter enemies. In 1175, the assassins even managed to weather an attempt by Saladin to destroy their movement. Concerned by his rise to prominence at the start of the decade and his measures to reintroduce Sunni Islam into Egypt, a large group of assassins ambushed the iconic leader whilst he was campaigning in Syria. Although Saladin survived the attack, even fighting off a number of young assassin initiates personally, his security measures were drastically stepped up as a result of the attack. He kept an armed retinue around him at all times and refused to meet personally with any guests he didn't know the identity of. Many of his courtiers even started wearing chainmail under their robes in case of a sudden attack. A year later, when Saladin attempted to besiege the castle of Masyaf, he was stopped by his advisors, warning him that if he seriously tried to do this, the old man of the mountain would mark members of his close family for death and would keep sending initiates after them until the siege was lifted. There even survives a dramatic, albeit fanciful story of how an assassin envoy came to broker peace with Saladin, only to draw his sword in the meeting, and, when challenged, asked Saladin's own guards if they would kill him in the name of the old man of the mountain. The guards said they would, and Saladin immediately sued for peace. It's unlikely that this happened in reality, but it's an interesting story nevertheless, and it demonstrates the fear in the period that the group seemed to be able to hit at any time at any place, without any effective means to stay safe against them. 20 years later, it was the turn of the Crusaders to feel the assassins' wrath, when they murdered Conrad de Montferrat, key candidate to the succession of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Rulership over the Holy City was a sore point of infighting between the knights of the Third Crusade, and in Conrad they found a strong potential candidate. When he was killed, fighting broke out again, with different factions blaming each other for the assassins' intervention, which plunged the Kingdom of Jerusalem into a long period of disarray and infighting, making them vulnerable to further incursion. In all likelihood, it was probable that the assassins themselves instigated the move, to ensure that Jerusalem didn't become too powerful and threaten their own influence in the region. This was therefore an extremely impressive track record from a relatively minor sect of Shia Islam. And for most of the 12th and early 13th century, the group saw a consistent string of success. Sadly, though, the movement's strength was not to last, and the eventual nail in the coffin of the movement would come as a result of the Mongols, an empire that consistently managed to defy political and military trends of the period, as we will see in later episodes. By 1255, things were not going well for the order. The Mongols had conquered a great swathe of Persia and the Middle East, and had set up a powerful dynasty in the form of the Ilkhanids. The Persianate order of the assassins, too, was rapidly disintegrating, and the Imam Ala ad-Din was losing his nerve, turning to drink and isolation to cope with the failure of his order. His son Rukn, seeing the chaos unfold, decided to take matters into his own hands, and had his own father beheaded whilst he was out tending to a flock of sheep on the nearby mountain valley, followed by the killer himself, so he could never be implemented in Ala ad-Din's death. Rukn ad-Din then struck out at the Ilkhans, having two of the prominent generals, Chagatai and Guyuk Khan, murdered. When the following Ilkhanid leader, Munkeh Khan, ordered reprisals, however, Rukn lost confidence and surrendered immediately to their rule, but not before sending as many as 400 assassins to try to kill Munkeh, all of whom were cut down before they met their target. When he came to Munkeh to broker peace, the Ilkhanid ruler refused audience and told him to go away and destroy all of his castles as a sign of loyalty. As Rukn left, however, he was seized by the Ilkhanid ruler's guards, wrapped in a carpet, and brutally kicked to death. This sounds horrific, but was in fact considered an honourable way to be executed, as since the time of the Abbasids, it had been custom that if a noble was to be killed, it should be done without the shedding of their blood. This was therefore a way to honour Rukun's status as the leader of an influential community, but naturally proved a grisly end to the final imam of Persia's assassin order. Rukn ad-Din's surrender wasn't taken lying down, however, and the majority of the Persianate branch resisted attempts to assimilate to Ilkhanid rule. Mankhay's response was characteristically brutal and efficient. If our sources are to be believed, as many as 12,000 members of the order were killed by the Ilkhanid army, and all of the assassin castles were laid to siege. The Mongols, by now, were experts at siege warfare, and despite the impressive defenses of the assassins' mountaintop fortresses, they were no match for the highly mobile and deadly Ilkhanid siege arsenal. It included heavy trebuchets that could be easily moved around and assembled and disassembled, that fired shells loaded with gunpowder, one of several curious weapons that made use of black powder before the advent of firearms, and a weapon that proved extremely effective, even against the stone walls of assassin castles. These were destroyed, along with, I'm sorry to say, the rich libraries within that had sizable texts on a variety of different subjects. By the end of the 1250s, the assassin order in Persia had been disbanded, and in 1272, the Mamluk ruler Baybars made a similar sweeping operation, bringing the Levantine branch of the order to heel and disbanding them shortly afterwards. By the start of the 1270s, the Assassin Brotherhood had ceased operations and no longer terrified the rulers of the Islamic world. Curiously, however, although the Assassin Order had fallen, the Nizari sect on which they were based continued through to the modern day. The sect lived more peacefully than its predecessors, spreading slowly across the Islamic world and producing a rich corpus of religious and poetic texts in Arabic, Persian, and a variety of Central Asian and Indian languages. Although they lacked the clout of the assassins before them, they were able to remain a sizable and lively minority group, whose peaceful activities in Persia saw a resurgence after 1501, when the Safavid dynasty became the first in a long line of Shia rulers of Persia, through to even the modern day. Things came to an apex in 1837, when the 46th Nizari Imam, Hassan al-Shah, was invited to become the governor of the city of Qom in Persia, home to some of the region's most famous and long-established schools of theology and law. From this, he gained the honorific title Aga Khan, meaning lordly king. The Aga Khan eventually went on to settle in Mumbai in India, having helped the British Empire fight the First Afghan War of the 1840s. He spent 30 years there building his wealth and breeding excellent racing stallions, before moving to Europe. Today, the Nizari movement has 50 million members in 30 countries, and is headquartered in Geneva and Paris, led by the 4th Aga Khan and 49th Nizari Imam, His Highness Prince Shah Karim al-Husseini, a Harvard-educated man and business mogul who took office in 1957, and 10 years later, set up the non-profit the Aga Khan Foundation, focused on sustainable development in the Islamic world. This is truly remarkable stuff, given that at their inception, the Nizaris were an obscure minority sect who had to rely on high-profile acts of violence to survive the fraught world of the medieval Middle East. And of course, the name assassin has taken on significant meaning in our modern vocabulary, and even now, the legacy of the assassins continues in the way that their name is associated with elite hitmen and hired killers. The word came into English in the 16th century from French and Italian, and by then had taken on the meaning of a treacherous killer, often associated with criminals or villains who murdered rulers. And this was expanded even further in the 1640s, when the first tract on the assassins was written for European audiences at the court of the French king Henry IV. In the modern day, however, the archetype of both the trained killer who lays down their life for the cause that they serve, as well as secret organizations that train elite hitmen, has become a staple inspiration for TV series, video games, films, and books. Some prominent examples of the modern day might include the titular characters of the James Bond and John Wick series, the Faceless Men from Game of Thrones, and Villanelle from the BBC series Killing Eve, as well as the Hitman series of video games, and the Dark Brotherhood from the Elder Scrolls series. Although probably not directly inspired by the Assassin Order and its actions, the archetype of the elite trained killer can certainly trace its roots back to the image that the medieval sources formed of a talented, fanatical murderer whose skill and devotion was so impressive that it spanned rumors as to the origins of their abilities. And of course, I couldn't discuss the legacy of the assassins in the modern day without mentioning Assassin's Creed, the hugely popular video game series developed by Ubisoft. For those unfamiliar, each game in the series is set across a wide variety of historical periods, and reimagines the assassins as a timeless secret order that fights throughout history with the Templars, their rivals, for control of powerful artifacts that could grant the wielders power over the entire world. The premise, of course, is more reminiscent of the Da Vinci Code than the actual origins of both organizations, but it's a fascinating idea nevertheless that has produced a series of games that have been consistently successful over 11 years since its first release in 2010. The first game especially has lots of parallels to the Assassin Order. It's set during the Third Crusades, and sees the player control a member of the Assassin Order and going to prominent cities across the Levant such as Damascus, Jerusalem, and Acre, to be assigned with killing prominent targets at the command of the Order. There's a number of neat callbacks to the real Assassin's history too, such as infiltrating cities by pretending to be a monk, and returning from each mission to the castle of Masyaf to gain fresh orders from Rashid ad-Din Sinan. I'm sorry to say, however, to our listeners who are fans of the series, that there's no evidence that the real-life assassins ever developed the iconic Hidden Blade as part of their arsenal. But nevertheless, this is perhaps one of the most enduring legacies of the medieval assassin order, as its members have joined the ranks of ninjas, pirates, and cowboys, and other similar historical figures that have captured the imagination of the modern media. I'll conclude by saying that the assassins were born of one of the most contested periods of history in the Islamic world, and used their ferocious reputation to carve out a place for themselves in a time when the aggressive Sunni Turks and Crusader kingdoms fought for dominance of the region. The assassins decided to push back against the marginalization of Shiites in the Levant and Persia, using their reputation for killing and remote fortresses to compete with armies and powers far greater than themselves, serving as a potent force in the region until their dissolution under the Mongols. The secrecy of their order, however, and the frightening way that talented killers could appear at any time and anywhere, made them subject to myth and speculation in sources, and has gone on to inspire one of the great staple tropes of modern film, television, and other forms of media. It is here that we end this episode, and over the coming months, we will continue to explore the period, from the Crusades to the rise of the empires of the early modern period, examining a variety of different topics, ranging from the fall of Al-Andalus to the golden age of Persian literature. In our next episode, however, we will be taking a break from the world of Crusades, and in recognition of Black History Month in October, we'll be looking at the presence of Islam in West Africa, and its ties to the empires of Mali and Songhai, one of the wealthiest economic hubs of the medieval world, and home to some of the most vibrant centers of Islamic scholarship outside of the Middle East. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next episode.